What is this? Is this political correctness or is it corruption? We're going to talk to Ildefonso Ortiz. He is an award-winning journalist at Breitbart, Texas. He co-founded the Cartel Chronicles Project with Brandon Darby and Stephen K. Bannon. Mr. Ortiz has focused his investigations on Mexican drug cartels, border corruption, and the Mexican narco politicians. So we've had a lot of news. Of course, the top of the Drudge Report today is another brick in the wall showing Paul Ryan there and the Border Patrol criticizing him for shutting down or delaying funding on the border wall. So I'd like to talk to Mr. Ortiz about that, as well as get his comments on the violence that we've seen with the MS-13 gangs that began a long time ago in L.A. with El Salvadoran immigrants. And now we see a lot of crime in Maryland and on Long Island. So welcome, Mr. Ortiz.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things we've seen is the Border Patrol Union president very angry about Paul Ryan, saying that he's going to delay this border wall. And, of course, we can always talk about the politics of this, whether it might have been wise to use the government shutdown as leverage to try to get a deal on the border wall. Nevertheless, they took a look at the politics of it. They made the decision. They're there on the ground. I won't second guess them on that. But, of course, it's Paul Ryan who doesn't really want to fight for this. And they asked Brandon Judd, who is the Border Patrol Union president, he said, President Trump promised he was going to secure the border, and part of securing the border is putting in place proper technology and resources that allow us to be successful as border agents. And a border wall in strategic locations is one of those things that must get done. Your comments as someone who's studied the immigration issue for quite some time.
Well, absolutely. You got to look at the border in some areas. For example, in Laredo, where there is literally nothing. The river is probably about knee-deep in some areas. And the Mexican drug cartels, particularly Los Zetas, which is one of the most dangerous ones, they know this, and they use that area as one of the strategic crossing points. And basically, they have unimpeded access into the U.S. In those key areas, for example, like Laredo, Border Patrol is understaffed, and they're overwhelmed by the traffic, by these organized crime syndicates. So, delaying funding, delaying all it's doing is helping these drug cartels continue their basically their reign because cartels control most of northern Mexico. They have pretty much set up an alternate form of government where they are actually in control of the regions. Yeah. And sadly, that has trickled into the U.S.
You know, there was a story about a week or so ago, and it might have been Breitbart's story. I don't recall who the source was on it, but they were talking about how, I think it was about 60 miles of the border, and one particular Border Patrol jurisdiction, the guy who was in charge of that, basically kept everybody away from there. So they had not only did they not have a fence, but they didn't have any Border Patrols whatsoever. And the other Border Patrol agents were furious about that. They said, what is this? Is this political correctness or is it corruption? Either way, when you have a situation like this, and we're looking at the violence in Maryland, and we're looking at the violence in Long Island, if people come here because they want to get a job or because they want to get into the American education system, whatever their reasons for coming here, coming across the border illegally, if they're coming here even peacefully, they're going to be followed by these gang members if we don't have any control of our border. And what we're seeing in Maryland and in Long Island are people who are Hispanic, who are the ones who are being singled out the most at this moment by MS-13 and these other gangs that are there. They're focusing on these people who have come here as immigrants. So the crime is following them into the country if we don't have anybody patrolling the border.
Well, one of the things we have to remember is that nothing crosses the river, nothing crosses the fence, nothing crosses that line without one of the cartels having a say-so. 20 years ago was very different. You know, people could actually cross, try to look for the American dream and that stuff. That has changed. It's changed in the 2000s when the Los Zetas began to basically set out territories where they were actually ruling over those areas, and they controlled the media, they controlled politicians, they controlled the military. And they basically set up a form of government, and that has spread out to the other cartels. So nobody can cross that border without paying the cartels to be able to have permission to cross through that area. Now, sadly, with the MS-13, these individuals, as dangerous as they are and as attention as they have brought to themselves in the U.S., they're actually only employees of the Mexican drug cartels. They have been hired out. They're basically gunmen for hire. A lot of the violent acts that they've done in the U.S. have been linked to the cartels. And the MS-13 have been the gunmen that have been carrying out those hits or those violent acts.
So they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're the visible tip of the iceberg. So when Attorney General Sessions says they're going to look at MS-13 as organized crime, maybe they're not looking at the right level?
That is correct. They need to look at the Mexican cartels who are the actual bosses. The problem with that is that they would have to look at the Mexican politicians who protect those cartels. And that's where you get into politics.
Yeah, that's what they don't want to do. Tell us about the Cartel Chronicles project.
Basically, in Mexico, journalists are not able to report on organized crime because it involves politicians and it involves cartels. So either one of those can quash them in an instant. The problem with that is that you have raging violence in Mexico where people basically have been kidnapped, murdered. You have raging gun battles at any time of the day. You have mass murder where people have been incinerated in ovens in places like Coahuila, where entire towns have been erased from the map. So you have all this violence going on, and it's being silenced. Nobody's reporting on it. The journalists that are able to report on it are basically told that you either stay quiet or you will be killed. So what's happening is that the U.S. media is not covering those violent incidents because they don't have sources down there. And what we did was basically we reached out to a handful of brave journalists and a handful of citizen journalists who are in those cities and that are willing to risk themselves to say, this is happening in my town. You may not hear this from the Mexican government. You may not hear this from an NGO. You may not hear this from U.S. media. But I'm telling you, this is happening in my town. And we've been very successful with that project, basically giving them a voice, protecting them, and letting them tell us their story. And that's why we've actually been running the stories in English and Spanish, because it's sort of an information boomerang. The info comes from Mexico into the U.S., and then people from Mexico are able to read what's happening in their towns, where, as well as our readers in the U.S. are able to know what's actually going on in Mexico.
That's very important. How many casualties would you say that Mexico has had with these cartel drug wars?
You're talking about the hundreds of thousands. The problem with those statistics is that the government does not keep accurate statistics. You have places, for example, in Coahuila or in Veracruz or in Tamaulipas, where the government made a concerted effort to hide the actual number of casualties. You would have these fierce firefights between cartel gunmen and the military, where dozens were killed, but the government would actually say 2 people were wounded or 1 person died. And in reality, you had these massive numbers of people that were killed. Also, when you have cartel on cartel violence, those bodies are actually incinerated, dipped in acid, or basically just made to disappear. They end up in shallow graves. That's why in recent years in Mexico, you've had a lot of mass graves that have been discovered with hundreds of bodies that, they were never reported missing. They were never, and they don't know who they are, because all these people are the unknown victims of the cartel violence that are not in any statistics or in any government documents.
It's very amazing when we look at this, and you're talking about the cover-up, the massive cover-up by the Mexican government. Of course, there's been a massive silence by the American media. We have this massive war right across the border. As you point out, 100,000 people possibly killed. We don't know the exact number because of the cover-up. And yet, we always have our attention focused onto the Middle East, not on this imminent threat right at our borders. This violence, this corruption is flowing into our country now at an unprecedented rate, and that is what we're going to be seeing in this country. And so it's amazing to me that we don't hear much about it in the American media either. There is, as you point out, a cover-up in the Mexican government, but there's a conspiracy of silence here in the mainstream media in America as well, isn't there?
Sadly, when you look at border reporting from journalists, it mainly focuses on immigration and the plight of the immigrant. But they haven't really focused on the cartels. Now, you mentioned the Middle East. Very interestingly so, some of the cartels, like the Los Zetas, have been known to be one of the most sadistic, brutal criminal groups out there. And I'm talking about posting beheading videos.
Yes, yes.
Where they dismember individuals.
And that's right across our border. And yet, if you talk about the crime, this organized crime that feeds on the drug war, if you talk about that, you're dismissed as being racist because you just have to focus on one side of it. And again, as I point out, if the people who are fleeing here because they want a better life, economic refugees coming into the country illegally, they're still being followed by these criminal cartels if we don't have any control over our border.
Sadly, yes. And in reality, the ones that actually control the border are the cartels. We have had cases where people have actually crossed without permission from the cartel, and they paid dire consequences. They've been kidnapped, held for ransom. The relatives have had to wire money from, the relatives in places like New York and Florida have had to wire money to the cartel to secure their release, while these victims have been actually tortured for daring to cross the river or cross that fence without paying protection from the cartel.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, as we look at sanctuary cities, and we got to take a quick break here in just a moment, but when we come back, I want to talk to you about the sanctuary cities because, as soon as Donald Trump was elected, we had amnesty groups in California saying they wanted to hide lists of gang members from Donald Trump because they did not want innocent people to be deported along with the gang members. So we're seeing the state of Maryland, in the face of all of this violence by MS-13 gangs and other drug cartels, saying they not only want to have sanctuary cities, but they want to be the first sanctuary state. Is there corruption as part of that? We'll ask that question to Ildefonso Ortiz. He's with Breitbart, Texas.
In ancient times, man roamed the earth in a constant state of hunting or being hunted. Introducing Caveman, where cutting-edge science meets ancient super nutrients. Secure your bottle right now at InfoWarsStore.com.